In 1991, I attended a SIL International Literacy Conference in Dallas, Texas. And one of the keynote speakers was Professor H.S. Bowler. And he was a leading consultant, leading expert in the area of establishing global literacy campaigns. And Dr. Bowler said one thing I've never forgotten. The moment he spoke it, it was like, this is true. And what he said was about projects and around project funding. He said, money has nationality. Never forget that money has nationality. And what he went on to explain that a US dollar has a different personality and a different expectation in terms of behaviour than, for example, an Indian rupee. That an Australian dollar has a different way of behaving and expectations than, for example, a Papua New Guinea kina. And when you understand this, it adds a complexity to the whole area of funding and partnership in projects. And I got that straight away because I worked in an Australian Aboriginal context. And as an Australian white, person, I'm brought up with the idea that my money belongs to me. I earn my money and I can do things with it. It's basically mine. And I then decide how it shares, but I control that. But my Aboriginal friends really saw money as a way of building relationships. The money belonged to the community, not to the individual. Money could not be owned like I felt I owned it. On the other hand, I was happy to share certain knowledge, and knowledge was free to be shared. But from their perspective, certain knowledge was actually owned. So it was a totally different worldview. Money has nationality. Now, we need to take this into account when we do project funding. Now, of course, for some people, money is about control and outcomes. You use money to achieve outcomes and control over a situation. But for other people, as I mentioned, money is about building relationships, and it's not about immediate things, it's about future obligations. For some, money is an investment in outcomes. But for those who receive it, it may be seen as an investment in a relationship. And Dr. Bowler went on to say this is a major cause of friction and misunderstanding in the global literacy movement. And my personal opinion, after working in project funding areas now for 30 years, is nothing has changed. It is still a major cause of friction. And I've heard numerous examples of this. A friend of mine, a leader in another country, who has a different view, I would say, of how money can and should be used and its personality than I do, was lamenting a situation where he had a strong funding relationship with a partner, and then he was notified that 50% of his project funding would be automatically cut. And it was painful for him, not because of the 50% cut in the funding so much, as because it represented to him a revelation that the relationship that he thought existed obviously did not exist, because the sharing of finances was about building the relationship. And he had not been engaged in the challenge that they were facing. There had been no prior conversation. It was almost like the accountants made the decision, and it was a great cause of angst. And this is repeated over and over again. And I think at the end of the day, Jesus made the comment that money is the root of all evil, or love of money is the root of all evil. I might, project funding context, I might say that the love of money as we perceive it, the love of money in terms of its personality and what we think it should do, what it achieves, the power it has, is the root of all evil. How I perceive money becomes a cause of angst. So in a cross-cultural setting, we talk often about greater understanding, empathy, understanding language, communication, sharing around tables in conversation. I think we've got to go, when we go really deep, we've got to be able to share about how do you view money? How do you view funding? What is going on here? We've got to have conversations around that before we say yes to project funding. So what's the best way forward with project funding? My personal view is the first thing is that as much as possible, all funding should be raised locally within the community, either in money or kind, and raised within the country. Because, for example, if you raise in Indonesia, you have Indonesian rupiah. If that's raised in the country, the people understand its personality and how it can be used. And so if you raise it locally, you can use it according to the local understanding. And that removes the friction. And this goes across the board. If I raise Australian dollars in Australia for the organisation I work with, I can spend that without too much thinking according to Australian values. And it removes the misunderstanding. So first, try and raise as much of the project locally, either in money or kind, and within country, because it removes that conflict. Second, in a major project, we'll often have components that are too expensive locally. And I would say, well, that's fine. You can raise that money for an expensive component within the project, as long as that component is part of the planning process, that that component it has been decided on by all the players in the project. It's been decided locally that this is a good idea, and it is not just the availability of funds that for a particular thing that you then add that thing because the funds are available. In other words, do your project planning first, do your creative thinking around how we're going to achieve these outcomes, and then ask where do we find the funds for that. Outside funding is not out of the question. It just needs to be in the context of the full plan of the project. But I do have one other thought on this, and again, this is personal, so I'm not speaking for any organisation. But if you're in a country and there's a project being run within that country, particularly for a marginalised group of people, I would suggest you should never take full funding from outside the country. That it is too big a risk. It can cause too much conflict, and that the goals that you're hoping to achieve in the project are lost because of the amount of money that's coming in. So full funding from outside a country, I think, is too big a risk to any project. And also, if you don't give the time for local participation, you don't. It's got to be a local vision to sustain the project is really important. Local collaboration, all those things need to happen first anyway. And if you take full funding from outside, you effectively give control to the funders of the project. And there's too much cultural differences to overcome. In my mind, and this is a bit sort of maybe contentious, I think full funding is more like an invasion. It's not a collaborative effort. The difficulty with the full funding model is the belief that money actually gives you the outcomes. And it's not money that gives you the outcomes. It's always people. Projects are people-based operations. They're not resource-based operations. They're people-based operations. It's the creativity of people, the passion of people that drives a project. And taking a full funding model can distract us from that. Now, a few years ago, an organisation well known to me opposed a program planning initiative in which they said to their partners, just imagine that funding was no limit, that there was no limit on funding. How would you plan and how would you achieve this project? Now, on the surface level, it sounded like a good question. Allow for green light thinking on what all the possibilities were. But the reality is that the only way there could be funding that was unlimited would be if it came from Western countries. And it came with the nationality, with the personality and the behaviour of Western money. And for me, that was terrifying. I found it very difficult to participate in such a discussion because money was seen as a means of achieving an outcome. Now, for me, a better question would have been, who are the people who would make this happen? What would the relationships between these people and the leaders of these organisations need to be to achieve the outcomes we're hoping for? What would be their level of sharing together, their level of fellowship together, their level of trust? What would their level of trust need to be? If we can get ultimate trust, ultimate engagement of passionate people, a shared vision for a country, we don't need to be talking about funding. The funding will take care of itself. It is people that drive projects. So as you plan your projects, funding will be front and centre at some point in the project. It is not the critical factor, right? It is always people that's a critical factor. Don't allow funding or where funding comes from to limit the participation and the drive of local communities. So that's probably my warning. Now, you will need to develop your own attitude towards funding ahead of time, almost before you start the project. Because if you don't, you can be swamped with an offer for funding that you're not ready for. So leave funding first in the background and then do your planning. And when you look at the resources you need to achieve, to implement the program, start looking widely within the community, within the country. You start building the vision for the project. And there will be at times really key overseas funders who are critical to this, and they will join you in the program, right? So I'm not saying no to overseas funding. I'm just saying no to dominant overseas funding. And this will be your challenge as you lead any project within your country. Now, in finishing, don't forget Dr. Bowler's comment. Money has nationality.